I want to start with the subject that I was talking about during the commitment session, and the thing that Rahm Emanuel mentioned. You remember, the Mayor Emanuel said, I've got 9% unemployment, 120,000 job openings. There are more than 3 million posted job openings in America today. Those jobs are being filled at roughly half the pace of previous recessions. If they were all filled, that would take a big chunk out of this job gap we've got. So I'm going to give our panelists a chance to talk about it, and I'll tell you a little about them as we go along. But I want to start with Michael Thurmond. Michael Thurmond is the immediate past labor commissioner of Georgia. He rose to some significant national attention because he was in charge of moving people to welfare to work in Georgia after the welfare reform law passed. And as a part of that, he learned quite a bit about job placement. And then he started a program called Georgia Works, which attempted to shorten the time between when a job was announced and it was filled. So, Michael, I'll begin with you. Is there anything that we can do right now in the world the way it is to shorten the time between when a job is offered and a job is filled?
Yes. It is clear the biggest challenge, we have 3 million job openings as we speak. As the president stated, if we fill those jobs today, the unemployment rate would decline by at least 3%. What we really have to do is to begin to look at the labor exchange itself. Filling those 3 million jobs must become our highest national priority. In Georgia, we initiated a strategy called Georgia Works, and really is pre-employment training. Historically, the methodology is you recruit, you hire, and you train new workers. Georgia Works focuses on recruit, train, then hire. The incentive for employers is that they get 6 weeks to train a new worker without having to pay employer taxes or unemployment insurance taxes or a salary. At the end of the 6 weeks, they then have the option to hire, or the person not hired receives a certificate of completion saying that they received certain skill sets. Right now in Georgia, there are 10,000 employers who participated, more than 15,000 job seekers, and since we began this initiative in 2003, we've had, during economic recessions as well as expansions, a 62% success rate. Every employer in this room can remember and understand what I'm saying. You get the perfect applicant, blue suit, nice blue tie, great resume, answer all the questions correctly, you hire them, governor, and then about 12 noon on the first day, you ask yourself, what in the world was I thinking? Georgia Works allows an employer to audition a potential employee. It gives the potential employee the opportunity to get their foot in the door. We provide a subsidy to offset training and child care. We also provide to the employee assistance in selecting the right people. It is a win-win-win scenario. We reduce the cost of unemployment insurance because most of the people are hired after the 4th week.
I want to just do one follow-up here, because this is very important. There's a lot of discussion about this issue in the country. But generally, people are saying, well, there must be a structural component to this. There must be something wrong with the American workforce. There must be something now wrong with the community college system. It's a training problem. What you're saying is that it's not necessarily a skills problem, it's a particular suitability problem. And if you give the employers the money up front before they have to pick these people as employees, you can shorten the time. So just to tell the people a little more what we were talking about the job friction issue, and then I'm going to go to Simonida and ask her to talk about it a little bit. But you don't think it's necessarily an indictment of the way the community colleges are working now, or you do? You think there's something wrong? Why is this happening, and why did you need to do what you did?
Well, it's not an indictment of the community colleges, and quite frankly, it sheds new light on this whole issue of have we done enough to stimulate the economy? Do we need more stimulus? Do we need greater tax cuts? We have 3 million jobs. What we have to recognize is until we fill those 3 million jobs, it's going to be difficult for employers to want to add additional workers. Our labor exchange in this country has been underfunded for more than 4 decades. And it's what Ms. Tyson talked about. When you say mismatch, we assume that it's a problem beyond reach. Who is responsible and what is responsible for making the match? It's a labor exchange. Throughout the history of our country, whether it was the Great Depression, World War II, the Korean War, even during the 60s, America mobilized its efforts to get unemployed people to work. So what we really need to do, focus on the jobs that we have today. We can argue forever about how we create more jobs, but we're overlooking the fact that there are jobs created, quite frankly, that are not filled. We need to move away from deficit-driven strategies to asset-driven strategies. We talk too much about what we don't have, and we haven't focused our efforts on what we do have. And what we do have right now are 3 million jobs that are not filled.
So, Simonida, tell us what you're doing in the Bay Area to help fill them.
So, Bay Area Medical Academy is training people for entry into the healthcare field. We train medical assistants, medical billers and coders, EKG technicians, and phlebotomists. And the key component to our training programs are this sort of on-the-job training portion of it. When you prepare someone for the medical field, every program has to have this component, but I believe it needs to be extended. And I would like to ask the employers, I wish Kaiser was here, or UCSF, the ones that actually hire students that have the job openings. Can you open your doors for people to train on the job? Because that's the best way to see if someone is a good employee. And that's the best way that someone learns and builds their resume. So Bay Area Medical Academy works with people who have barriers to employment. And one of the major barriers is that they don't have experience. They can't show it on their resume. It's all over the place. It's all short-term jobs. Another data that I wanted to point out is there's a study that was done that shows that from all the job openings from 2004 until 2014, about 45% of those are middle-skilled jobs. Middle-skilled jobs are the ones where you don't need a 4-year college degree, but you need some kind of technical training. So that's where we really have an opportunity to make a social impact. We have to help the people with the low skill level, bring them up to take the jobs on the middle skilled level. And that's where what workforce development is doing. I actually think the difficulty with the community colleges is that they only teach, and that's usually it's 2-year or 3 or 4-year. Technical schools really prepare you with the technical skills that you need, but what we also do case management. We help people overcome barriers. We have students that have past criminal records. We have students whose barrier to coming to class is they don't have childcare or they don't have transportation. They have a hard time coming to class. We have students who are taking care of someone at home who is disabled. So they have a difficulty following this through every day. And you really have to stick with them and help them out throughout the way. I have an example I can give you. We had a student who had a bad experience at the job training site and gave up and wasn't answering our phone calls. Where is Karen? Where is Karen? And someone said, she took a job part-time at Starbucks. I said, I'm going to go down there and get her. And I got her. And she went back to the classroom. So we need 3 things. We need technical skills preparation, we need case management to help people overcome barriers, and we also need very close involvement with the employers. That's the key. The employers are the key. It has to start from there.
I just want to point out, when I talk to people around the country about these problems, I hear all the time, how are you supposed to get a job if it requires some past experience if you never had any? What about the problem populations like young people who've been in the juvenile justice system or people who've been in the criminal justice system? What about people who've we're still trying to move from welfare to work? All of this can be answered in part with a case management system that puts what Michael did was essentially give the job training money to the employer up front so that you got somebody on the job, but they're not really on the job. They're not really an employee yet. And I think these are the kinds of things that we need to do more of. Governor, what's your reaction to what you just heard? And what are you doing in Mississippi?
Mr. President, it fits very much into what I found when I became governor. Our unemployment was high when I became governor. I had a job summit with about 700, about this size crowd of employers, politicians, community leaders, educators. And they said 3 things we need to do. Don't raise taxes, improve the quality of the workforce, tort reform. So we looked at our community colleges, and they're very good, but they were not getting any reward for workforce development and job training. They all wanted to be little universities. We put more money in the pot. We created a workforce enhancement training fund to ensure that we would at least double what was being put into workforce development. We got the employers involved early, working with the community colleges. All of a sudden, the community college decided this is a pretty good deal. And I'll have to tell you, there were some people in the legislature that said, instead of putting more money into job training at the community colleges, let's increase unemployment compensation. And my legislature, my Democrat legislature, did not do that. They said, no, we want to invest in our workforce so more people will be working rather than paying people more for not working. And to tell you, the first 2 years, people who participated in the Workforce Enhancement Training Program, after 2 years were making $7,000 a year more than they were before they entered the program. The community colleges took it seriously. This all of a sudden became a key role for them. And the employers became even more involved because they saw it worked. We have a steel mill in Columbus, Mississippi, Mr. President. Severstal, the big Russian steel company, owns it. It was the most efficient steel mill in North America last year. 95% of the people who worked there had never seen a steel mill until they started working in one. And how did we do that? Well, the Russians and the people in the U.S. who were working with them, they helped our community college teach these farm boys and girls how to make steel in a mini mill. And it has been hugely successful. And we've done that with Toyota, we've done that with Nissan, we've done that with General Electric Aviation. But we have got to quit stigmatizing skills training and trades in the United States. You know, if Marcia, who you know, I'll finish, but I have to tell this little story. If Marcia and I have been married 40 years, and if our baby Reeves, 13 years ago when he was getting ready to go to college, if Marcia had gone to the beauty parlor and said, well, Reeves has decided he's not going to go to Ole Miss, he's going to go up to Holmes Community College and learn a trade. Now, what would they have said at the beauty parlor? Well, Marcia, what's wrong with him? We have got to destigmatize skills training if we're going to employ these people in the United States, and we're working hard at it.
Thank you. You mentioned something else. I just want to discuss this, and I'll put it in now. I was going to do it later, but Laura, Governor Barbour talked about the whole skills training issue and how they declined to increase unemployment and put the money into training instead. One of the most interesting things to me as I studied how all these different countries were navigating the aftermath of the global financial crash were which countries had unemployment rates that were substantially lower than ours. And you know, the export markets were just killed by this crash for a while. But Germany never had an unemployment rate that got higher than 2% lower than wherever we were. And I believe one reason is they have an employment, not an unemployment policy. That is, before a company lays somebody off and then the person goes and draws unemployment, they can draw from the same kind of trust fund that we have for unemployment funds. The company can get some money to cover about 20% of the salary of the worker if the company will keep the person working. And then, in order to avoid it being an unjust subsidy to the company, when the economy returns to normal, they have to give it back up. Do you think that we should re-examine the unemployment system in America? And if we did, might we keep GDP higher and employment levels higher?
So I think there really is a agreement among people who look at this that we really do need to look at our unemployment system and also our disability system, because our unemployment system really, despite it's not a particularly generous system and compared to other countries. I do want to start there. And there's very little evidence, really very little evidence, that any of the unemployment problem we're talking about is a result of people choosing to be unemployed to collect unemployment compensation. It just isn't what has happened to our economy. I think that Germany, Denmark, a number of the European countries have reformed their system. They offer very generous benefits, but they also do a number of things. You mentioned the German example. Another thing they do
but
is
it's
basically
pro-work. They pay the companies to keep people working instead of the workers to make lower money to sit home.
And they also they put very serious requirements on getting retrained while you're collecting unemployment compensation. So it's a couple of things. You give the incentive to the employer to keep the person on, and by the way, while they're keeping them on, perhaps to train them for another job, but you also give the worker an incentive, actually a requirement, to get retraining while you're collecting the unemployment compensation. And they've done a lot of work in Germany, in addition, to do much better matching efforts, sort of to get someone, really the kind of thing that we were talking about earlier, finding a worker and matching them if they're unemployed to a job opportunity. So there are a lot of things we can do. I think the German model, the funny thing is 10 years ago we looked at Germany and said their system of technical training was very good, and I remember we looked at that in the United States. Very good technical training, highly skilled workers. But they had a very high unemployment rate and a very inflexible system. They added a whole bunch of flexibility to it, and we now see an economy which is doing much better. So there's a lot to learn, and we should actually look at it, reforming our unemployment compensation and disability systems.
Mr. President, could I step in? Because for 12 years, I ran the unemployment system in Georgia, and we also did initial administrative decisions on the disability program at the state of Georgia. Think about it. Last month, when we announced the unemployment rate, it was announced that Laura, 54,000 new jobs were created in May.
Yeah, private.
In the private sector, non-farm. But you had 3 million job vacancies. So wouldn't it have made equally as good sense to announce how many jobs, what was the percentage of jobs being filled? See, the American public thinks, well, we only generated 54,000 jobs. What it really says is that we filled 54,000 of the vacant jobs, which is totally different. We need a system that incentivizes employment. As Laura said, very, very few people that I know choose unemployment insurance to employment. You only get 33% roughly of the salary you lost before you were laid off. Unemployed individuals would much prefer to work. So what we have to do is create that system that incentivizes it. One of the challenges we face, even with our unemployment insurance program, is when we said that UI recipients could receive training on the job while they continue to receive unemployment benefits, and therefore help to create your job. Our theory is, why wait for the Federal Reserve, why wait for Congress, why wait for anybody? Every unemployed person only needs one job. So create your own job. And that's what our strategy does. It empowers unemployed Americans to take control of their economic destiny. The one mistake we made is we've been waiting for somebody to come and create a job. Create your own job through your own innovation, your own skill, and your own determination. That's what we need a system that will do.
I want to ask Pete Peterson a question. First of all, he's had a wonderful career in business. He's been a public servant. He's made a lot of money as an investor. He seems to be determined to give most of it away while he's still alive. And he has become probably the face of America's obsession with our rising national debt, which I like. So there's one thing we just ought to put on the table, and I think that we'd start with Pete to be very explicit about it. There's a big debate about, among people who care about the debt, we'll posit that. Some people act like it's no big deal if we borrow a lot more government money because interest rates are low. I'm not one of those people. For one thing, we have to borrow the money from overseas, and it undermines our national sovereignty. The more money you borrow from overseas, the people that loan it to you are the people with big trade surpluses. It becomes harder to enforce our trade laws, and it weakens the future of the country. I don't agree with that. I also think aggregate debt levels really matter a lot, and one day if you don't take care of them, you wind up in the position that Greece and other people are today. So I think it's important. The real question is this: in the moment, and this is relevant to the debate, how this gridlock in Washington might be resolved. It's not just a question of how you reduce the annual deficit and the debt of America over a decade. It's also a question of when. How is important, when's important. The British are now experimenting with what happens if you have a big cut in government spending when interest rates are zero and private demand is little, and will it create so much confidence in the private sector that the banks, which also there now have money, will loan enough so that there'll be private economic activity which will more than swamp public economic activity. Now that's what happened when I was president. When we started, and Laura and I were having our debates about how low you could get unemployment before inflation returned, we had an old-fashioned recession. And America had a lot of debt and high interest rates, and we knew if we cut the deficit a lot, interest rates would drop, investment would go up, and the private economic activity would be so much greater than the public economic cutback that we'd have growth. That happened. But Pete, how do we thread this needle now if we can't be sure that private economic activity in the short run will be enough? Well, some people actually say that if we had a huge cut tomorrow, that government revenues might drop even more than spending's cut, and we might not do anything about the deficit. What is the answer? What's the answer to, and I'm not advocating more stimulus, I'm just saying, what's the answer to where we are right now today and dealing with the long-term debt and making sure that these people have the money to do what they're talking about to close the employment gaps?
Well, Mr. President.
Put your mic closer up so we can hear.
Yeah. As you suggested, I believe that the long-term debt is the transcendent threat to our long-term economic future. But at the same time, I think it is a very good way to create jobs both in the short and long term. But we first, I think, need to agree on a sustainable long-term path that we implement when the economy has recovered. So I think the existence of a long-term plan would in itself have some very important positive effects.
Can you all hear?
Okay.
Yeah.
It wasn't worth listening to anyway.
No. Yeah, it was. That's the most important thing. He said if you had a long-term plan, that would have a positive impact on the economy today. And Laura was nodding her head too. Go ahead.
You want me to? So the very presence of that plan is what is essential. The timing of it should take place when the economy has recovered, so it's not a drag. Now, why is it helpful in the short term, which is what this conference is importantly about? I think we badly need confidence at this point. Among all these foreign lenders you talk about,
They still can't hear you, Pete. You got to have the microphone closer. Michael will hold it.
There you go. That's good, yeah.
I'm not used to having people listen to me, so. In the short term, we very much need confidence, Mr. President, among the foreign lenders that we so dangerously depend upon, but also investors. I remind you that we have trillions of dollars now sitting in banks and corporations that would be much more likely to be invested if these companies had confidence in America's future. Now, on the other hand, imagine what would happen if we had a financial crisis, if you want to look at the negative side. And imagine if this would happen. The foreign lenders that we depend on take a look at our fiscal and long-term picture and decide they don't have much confidence in it. And therefore, we better increase interest rates 2 or 3% to compensate us for the risk. Imagine what a 2 or 3% increase in interest rates does to housing, does to economy, and indeed to jobs. So there is both a positive and a defensive or negative aspect to this. Now, there's just one possibility as a crisis, but as far as these crises are concerned, to be honest with you, Mr. President, and I don't know whether Laura would agree with me, we don't really know when a crisis would take place, what form it would take place, and so forth. But it could come sooner than we think, as we discovered in Europe. I'm reminded of what Yogi Berra said, what he said, it can get late early out there. And that's what we need to be thinking about. Now, in the long term, what I believe a plan helps us with is to help provide the resources to improve investment, competitiveness, and so forth. Now, economists, other than Laura, don't agree on much of anything. But I think, Laura, most of them agree we should become more of an investment savings economy that invests much more in R&D and in infrastructure and education and all this sort of thing. But the daunting question, Mr. President, is where are we going to get those resources? Because as I analyze our current path, we have massive claims of our resources in areas that have very little to do with investment or even the future. I'll give you a few very quick examples. Ballooning interest payments, which is one of the obvious effects of these long-term deficits. As I look at the numbers, they absolutely dwarf the government investment in research, education, infrastructure, and so forth. How about the trillions in unfunded entitlement promises? I have already reached the age, you're about to get there, I guess, where payments that go to people like me, old codgers like me, have very little to do with the future. And yet they consume trillions of dollars of resources. Rocketing healthcare costs that have a dramatic effect on our competitiveness and in line with what Laura is saying, our wage growth in this country. Then we have the fact that we have a defense budget that I think is virtually unchecked in many respects. Now, each one of those areas has very little to do with investment and the future. Now, while I believe a long-term fiscal plan is necessary, it's not sufficient. I think that we need to add to that what you're doing at this conference and elsewhere. We need to come up with ideas on what to do with that investment and how to create more jobs. But today, I think we need to focus more on how do we get the funding to do these actual investments. Mr. President, someone once said, when economics becomes important enough, it becomes political. I guess your version of that was, it's the economy, stupid, in your campaign. Well, what I'm talking about, Mr. President, is I think we need a fundamental reallocation of resources in this country toward innovation and toward investment. Now, sadly enough, if you look at each of these huge claims on our resources, virtually every one of them are backed up by deeply installed special interests. So this is not only an economic problem that I'm talking about, it's a deeply political problem. And I think the American people need a positive vision that says, if you will make these sacrifices, this is the kind of America that we will become. And I don't think a campaign, you're the politicians, not me, a campaign built on sacrifices is likely to be a winner. So I think it's extremely important that people that have the talent that you and Haley Barbour have come up with a way of inspiring the American people so that they are happy or willing to make the sacrifices and take advantage of the remarkable strengths that this country has in entrepreneurialism and so forth. So let me close on the note that what I'm suggesting to you today is beyond the capabilities of policy wonks like, if I may say so, Laura, you and I. At least I have negative charisma, and I think what we need are people like yourself and Governor Barbour who have genuine charisma to help sell the American people on the need for this transition. Now, finally, may I say something that I really feel about you. I want to not only express gratitude for your holding this conference, but I'm old enough now that I have a pretty good sense of what presidents do, former presidents, in their post-presidency life. And I know of no one who comes even close to you in living a more productive presidency.
If I can connect to this story, we do need a reallocation of resources, and we need investment in small businesses. We need microfinance in the United States. We need what you did in '95 with the reform of the Community Reinvestment Act. We need lending by the banks for small business. It's not happening. Let's be honest. The credit crunch is ongoing, and small businesses have a really hard time qualifying for loans through the traditional banks. I started my business with only $1,000. I was a single mom with 2 little girls. And I was looking for a way to be able to spend more time with them and a way to make money for me and for them. And I was denied by the bank when 3 years later I asked for a loan. But I found Opportunity Fund. Opportunity Fund is a microfinance organization that initially lent me only $10,000. And the effect of those $10,000 are I added 10 jobs, which was double. My payroll went up 4 times because I hired teachers that are higher paid. And now I train over 500 students a year. So there's a ripple effect. We need money to go to small businesses. We need the banks to open up their doors. If I can say this also as a Goldman Sachs alumni from before, I would like to see Wall Street give money directly to microfinance, community-based organizations. That's where we create businesses. That's how we create businesses.
Mr. President, no, go ahead, Doctor.
I only just want to underscore that by saying that I pointed out, historically speaking, when the U.S. economy was very strong and the unemployment rate when President Clinton left office was 4%. And we hadn't seen an unemployment rate that low in the post-war period. So first of all, this economy was capable of, and has been capable of, low unemployment rate before. It's been capable of high entrepreneurship rates before. The way people funded those things now is closed off to them because so many people funded it out of their own personal debt. They funded it out of their MasterCard. They funded it by borrowing against the value of their house. Those are all gone now. People have to deleverage. They're bringing their debt levels down. So I think the need for microfinance in the United States is much more dramatic now because people don't have the mechanisms they used to have. So
Yeah, and to be fair, I want to call on Governor Barbour, but to be fair to the banks on this, we haven't, for at least 40 years, it's been hard for small businesses and startups to get a traditional bank loans, both when bank regulations were tough and banks were worried about taking too much risk, or because the transaction costs of a lot of small loans don't leave a big return. So you create the return either through a guarantee system like the SBA loan program or through people set up in this business only so they have a far better chance of success and they know what they're doing. That's what the microcredit networks do. But I think it's really important, the point Laura made is that given the skittishness of the banks now, even though I started this conversation by saying I want to get bank lending up, for the startups, it might be even more important than it was when we began this in 1995 to have groups like Kiva and others that we announced today do it. That's a significant point that I don't think I've focused on. So, Governor.
I don't think it'll come as a surprise to many people. I want to associate myself with what Rahm Emanuel said. Since we always agree. Rahm got up here and said, correctly, the private sector creates jobs. Government doesn't create jobs. It's the government's role to have an environment in which the private sector can create jobs. And what Michael talks about, I admire of what they've done in Georgia. We've tried to do some stuff in Mississippi. But in the macro economy, a bigger government means a smaller economy. If you look at Simonida and talking about growing jobs, I think Dr. Tyson will say the data is clear. As private investment goes up in the United States, there is a parallel, almost exactly linear increase in employment of the number of people working. And when the government sucks so much money out of the economy, 25% of GDP right now going to the federal government, not to mention what us states and local folk are spending, I think we have to realize that that is a huge barrier to employment. When I'm an employer and keep being told they're going to raise taxes on employers, I don't know what my health insurance responsibilities, obligations, or costs will be. The cost of energy is going up, and the government is running a $1.5 trillion annual deficit. I mean, when you were president, the idea of a $1.5 trillion deficit, we would have thought was just bizarre. Well, we're going to do that 3 years in a row, and I think that is a gigantic impediment to Main Street, small business, and to our whole economy. So, Pete, I'm with you. We got to quit spending so much money on things and let the private sector grow.
Well, first of
all these right wingers.
Some of the, let me also point out, when I left office, the size of the federal workforce was the same size it was in Dwight Eisenhower's last year in office. Because I think there's a difference in the size argument and what you do with what you got argument. essentially, we gotten ourselves in a position where we're spending too much money on today and yesterday and not enough money on tomorrow. And we're borrowing too much so that once the economy picks up, and we may be here, we're creating tomorrow's problem if we solve today's problem, because if every idea that's going to be celebrated at this meeting were adopted day after tomorrow, there would be a huge demand for capital, which would begin to be met, which would in turn drive up interest rates, which would, to go back to what Pete says, raise the cost of servicing the federal debt, because interest rates would go up and we would be in a whole different pickle. So I agree with what Haley said. When 92% of the jobs created in the 8 years that I served were private sector jobs. And I don't think it's fair to blame my successor on the fact that how much higher percentage in his term were created in the government, because we had to have an appropriate response to 9/11. But we didn't create enough private sector jobs. And what we have to do today is to figure out how to sort through all that. And we'd probably have an argument over where the appropriate balance is. We can't afford to spend 25% of GDP on government expenditures. I don't think we can afford to tax at only 15% of GDP either, which is about where we are. But somewhere we need to go back to Pete's argument. We need a 10-year plan that says to America, this is what we're going to do. This is what we think would be a competitive level of revenues and a competitive level of expenditures. And one of the problems I have with this whole discussion today that's not ours, the one in Washington, is there's a certain air of unreality to it, because as we get rid of the stimulus spending, the deficit will go down some. But also keep in mind, at the peak of this recession, we had 1 in 7 Americans on food stamps. I mean, a lot of people have forgotten just how close we came to a big depression. So and my party needs to be careful about saying, over-exaggerating how low the taxes are, because the percentage of GDP coming from revenues will also go up as the economy recovers. And what Pete and his institute have done such a good job of is showing us what the long-term structural liabilities are. And that's what and I just would like to ask you all we're not going to resolve this budget debate here today, but you need to think about two things. First of all, the government's issues. That is, what is the long-term structural feeders of the government debt? And he pointed out it's principally the big money is in Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, defense, and interest on the debt. That's 87 cents of every dollar you pay in taxes. So the first thing that I think a lot of Republican governors where we could get bipartisan agreement on is, we want to save as much of that 13% that's left for investment in our future in a way that grows the economy as possible, to create the conditions so the economy can grow. Then beyond the government, we need to look at where America as a system is spending more on today and less on tomorrow. For example, Medicare is the biggest driver of this budget deficit. Medicare spending per person in the last 40 years has gone up 400%. Terrible problem. Private insurance premiums in the last 40 years have gone up 700%. In 2009, at the depth of the recession, when everybody else was going broke, insurance company profits, health insurance, went up 26%. 5 million people lost their health care. 3 million were picked up by Medicare and Medicaid, and the budget deficits of state and federal governments went up. So I'm prepared, and if I were still running for office, I'd be prepared to take all kinds of heat to deal with Medicare reform, but you can't fix it without fixing the overall fact that for 20 of the last 30 years, medical inflation has been going up at 3 times the rate of overall inflation. So these are big structural issues. You all talk about that at lunch. Meanwhile, let's get back to the subject, or talk about the meeting. I think there is a consensus that if our if the White House and Congress could agree on a long-term plan and identify the elements of it to bring the budget back into balance and to eliminate this debt, and to do it in a way that did not compromise but actually speeded up our investment in private sector jobs and new entrepreneurs, that in itself would be an economic positive which might get more bank lending done today and get more American companies to invest in America today. That's the point you're making, right? Yes, and do you agree with that, Haley?
Yeah, Mr. President, could I be bold enough to ask the two of you a question? If I am correct, and I rarely am, but let's assume for the moment I am, and we have to have a serious discussion in this country about how we're allocating our resources away from today and the past, much more into the future. But it's going to require some very tough choices in order to reallocate those resources. I made the point that I think we need some kind of positive vision of some sort of what this great country will look like if we get our act together. Now, I had some personal experience with this that won't rival yours, but I had a Greek mother, immigrant mother, who was very good at Greek pastries. And we all know what the calorie content is of Greek pastries. And she and I had a bilateral understanding that the more of those pastries I ate, the more I loved her. See? And it was a good deal as far as I was concerned. The only problem was my weight went up to 245 pounds. So I had tried everything and it didn't work. So I went to a psychiatrist doctor who specialized in weight. And he explained to me that congenital eaters like me had an awful time giving up things and sacrificing for them. And we needed a positive vision of what we wanted to look like. And you remember those county fairs? We had them in Nebraska. You probably had them, these mirrors that change the looks of things. He said, "How much do you want to weigh, Pete?" And I said, 175. He dialed in some numbers, and I look at this screen, and there I am, younger, sexier, you know, better looking. Now, he gave me some ways I could reconstruct that positive vision several times during the day. Now, you're the political geniuses like me. I'm sure you acknowledge that it's a very tough job to get the country reoriented. How would the two of you go about it if you agree with me that it's part of the job?
Well, first thing, I'd like to get the name of that doctor. Or at least find out where we can buy those mirrors.
But you don't want the Greek pastry.
Pete, I mean, I think the truth is almost always the right answer. And the first thing, the American people need to understand the truth of where we're going to be if we don't do what you're talking about. I mean, the people that say, keep Medicare like we have it today, it's not going to be like we have it today when the Obama administration and their actuaries tell us in 12 years you're not going to have any money. That people have to understand the consequences. And maybe that's my Presbyterian self coming out, but I think we really need to tell people the truth. And the people are people are smarter than politicians give them credit for. People are up to hearing the truth, and they will deal with the truth. But they need to know the truth of what happens if we don't deal with these issues, because every year it gets harder. There's a cascading effect, and every year it gets harder to deal with.
What I think, Mr. President, and Pete didn't ask me, but I'm going to chime in anyway. A big problem, and I've been in politics for 20 plus years, the toxic partisan environment that seems to dominate Washington. Now, partisanship has always been a part of American politics. But I'm also aware as a political historian that when President Reagan was in office, he worked with Tip O'Neill to solve America's problems, even though they were strong partisans. When President Clinton was in office, he worked with Newt Gingrich to solve America's problems. But we have to understand that there is no Republican solution to this economic crisis. Not a strictly Republican one, and it's quite frankly not a strictly Democratic one. There is an American solution to the problems that we face. As Americans, we, I think, forget that the people who are intent on destroying this nation, who are somewhere sitting and plotting as I speak to bring this nation down, they don't distinguish when they put those improvised explosive devices on the highways of Afghanistan and Iraq. They don't distinguish with American soldiers with the ones who vote Republican or the ones who vote Democrat. It makes no difference. They didn't distinguish who was in the trade centers or who was working at the Pentagon. We have to understand that this is an American challenge, but only Americans can resolve it. It won't be the Republicans or it won't be the Democrats. It's going to be Americans. And that's what's missing, and that's what we've lost.
But can I also wasn't asked by Pete, but I'm going to try to connect what Pete said to what Haley said too, and that is, I think in order to give people some positive vision, you have to give them some hope, and I don't think it's fair right now. If you go to the macro numbers again, the number of people who, for no fault of their own, find their jobs lost, find their homes lost, find their schools lost. I don't know if any of you saw, but it was so depressing, to the point of tears. 60 Minutes did the segment again last Sunday night, about all of these kids who are homeless because both parents lost jobs. And they're living in hotels, they're living in one room with their parents. One of them already dropped out of high school because he could get a job and his parents get, this is just terrible. So and during the expansion in the 2000s, which I didn't mention, the expansion from 2001 to 2007, that will go down as the dubious expansion in the US economy where median family income actually fell. It didn't rise. There was no expansion in the 2000s for the median family in the United States, none. So people are not, I think, if you set out a vision for them, which says, here's a vision, and by the way, you have to sacrifice your Medicare, you have to sacrifice your Medicaid, you have to sacrifice your unemployment compensation, you have to sacrifice your Social Security because we can't afford it anymore. I don't think right now is a moment when that's going to have a lot of resonance with the median person in the United States. That's why I think what Pete said is so important. In order to get the long-run deficit problem right, we actually have to make sure we do a whole bunch now to convince Americans that we're back on track. We cannot, it seems to me, I do not think the British model is going to work for us. I think if we start slashing, pardon?
I don't think it's going to work for them.
I don't think it's going to work for them either, by the way, but if they want to try it, that's up to them. We actually don't have to try it. We don't have to try it. If we announce a credible plan, a multi-year plan, given the real underlying strength of the economy and our position in the world, we're going to be able to finance that plan. But if we don't announce it, if we allow political impasse in Washington to lead the rest of the world to say, these guys aren't serious, they maybe are going to default, we don't know, they're just not serious, we're going to actually we're going to inflict injury upon ourselves. So I completely agree with Pete that we really need a very long-run plan that lays it all out, that will involve some sacrifice for sure, but we've got to make sure that right now we're giving people hope by what we do right now. In terms of the kinds of things that are being discussed here in the next 2 days, people are getting hope through the efforts of individuals. Governor Barbour had a great story that he was talking with Ram about the plan coming to Mississippi. There are things that can be done with government help, by the way. In the Mississippi plant example, Mississippi government put money into incentives to get the plant to locate there. That's the government working in partnership. So partnership is really important. I think we've got to get that vision in place in order to convince people that the long-run sacrifice is necessary and worth it.
And I would like to connect to this also. I think it's important to give people stories, success stories. So not only the macro, but the micro, personal stories. So I can give you a story here. I have somebody in the audience, Sapaya Webb. Can you stand up? Sapaya, she's my chief of staff now, so I have to introduce you. She came to my school to take a class through the welfare program. And on her resume, among the 10 different things, I saw that she knows how to build websites. I asked her to build a website. Then later we did our first brochure with her face on it. And her son came and asked me, "Is this my mom?" I said, "Yeah, that's your mom, and that's your mom also teaching to the students." 5 years later, Sapaya is the key person that I have at the office. I put all my trust in her. She's the manager of employer relations, employer engagement manager, and her son just won an award for Young Men Blacks Achievement Award this year. So, trusting in the American people, showing the American people that we believe in them and giving them the chance, investing directly in them and giving them the power to turn the situation around. That's what we need. And we need to hear this kind of stories so people see that there is hope, that it's possible to do something like this, to make a big change.
Look, I am an American success story. I'm a living, breathing example of what America can do through investing in public education and grants and scholarships. My dad sharecropped cotton in Georgia. Yeah. I'm a third generation descendant of Georgia sharecroppers. He could neither read nor write, a brilliant man with no education, but because of public education, because of grants and scholarships in college and law school, in one generation, we went from a sharecropper who could not read to a lawyer, to a legislator, to a labor commissioner. And anybody who thinks that government does not have a role to play, it's just not real. I'm here today because government invested in my life.
We got to wrap this up, but I want to say, first of all, you are. Secondly, in a radically different way, Haley and I are. When we were born, our states, white and black alike, had a per capita income barely half the national average. The poverty rate was 25%. If you had a place to sleep and clothes on your back and food to eat, you didn't have any better sense. You didn't know you were poor, right? This young woman, it's an amazing story. Her people are ethnic Serbs from Macedonia and Kosovo. And her family had the courage to stay in Kosovo even though they were in the minority. That's what makes America great, and why I hope we'll resolve this immigration impasse too, by the way, because we need more people like her in this country. Pete's people came from Greece. You heard that story. Here's what I think we should do. If you want to know, I think first of all, I always try to say, this is what I want America to be like in the 21st century. China may rise, India may rise, Brazil may rise, Russia may rise, Europe may get their act back together and rise. I want them all to rise. I wish them well. But I want America to be the world's leading force for peace and freedom and prosperity and innovation and creation. That's what I want. In order to do that, the American dream has to be alive and well. That means you can work from poverty into the middle class, and you can do better. In order to do that, we have to be a creative and innovative country. I want us to be a country where we have shared opportunities to be prosperous and where we assume shared responsibilities for our common problems. I want us to be a country where we can all be different, but we think our common humanity matters more. And I don't mind sharing the world stage with other countries. That's a good, healthy thing. But America, because we're not an imperialist country, still needs to be out there standing up for opportunity and freedom. That's what I want. Now, how do you get there? You have to figure out how we're going to grow the private economy and what the role of government is, and how to deal with this cancerous threat that the exploding debt is. Politically, how I think the best way to work on it is, first of all, we need people like you with real authority who've put your life into this for 30 years to say, let's make the decision now and then decide as we go along when to drop the hammer on these various things based on what the current economic circumstances are. But what I'd like to see them do is say, let's see, where would we like to be 10 years from now? And then draw up scenarios. What if, I believe that government should always run balanced budgets except in terrible recessions. I try to get America out of debt. I hate all this stuff, but it's probably my depression heritage. Where would we be if the government took in revenues at 20% of GDP and the government spent at 20% of GDP 10 years from now? Work back. What if it was 19? Work back. What if it was 18? Work back. Based on current facts, I think it's unlikely you could get below 18, and actually the present tax system would get you pretty close to 18 if we had a normal economic recovery. That's about where we'd be. And go within those ranges, and then give people something realistic to talk about. Then I think we should be honest about our toughest problem. I'll tell you why I think Medicare is the toughest problem. Not just for the politics. I remember when in the last election you had people harassing Democrat congressmen saying, I don't want the government messing with my Medicare. It's not just that it's a problem like that. It is, as I tried to point out, the financial problems of Medicare are intimately caught up with the nature of the medical system. And if you're in the White House, if you're in the Congress, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, and you vote on these budget things, you do it, Haley knows, he lived there a long time, you get the Congressional Budget Office and the Office of Management Budget, they give you a cost estimate. If you do this, it'll cost this. If you do that, it'll save that. But the medical system, the healthcare system in America is highly complex, highly dynamic, and costs $1 trillion more than any other country's healthcare system would cost. And if you want to bring it in line with our competitors, which I believe is essential, without messing it up, then you have to acknowledge that the most important things we could do, we can't cost. I'll just give you one example. A doctor named Atul Gawande, who was, full disclosure, he was a White House fellow when I was president, wrote a book called The Checklist Manifesto. He's a brain surgeon. And he participated in a 5-hospital, 3-continent experiment, including a very poor hospital in rural Africa, one in Asia, one in Europe, 2 in the United States. So radically different incomes. And they did a simple thing. They did, at 5 steps in people's hospital stays, everybody had to wash their hands and take other sterilization measures. And when they did that, from the richest to the poorest countries, they had uniform results. Infections dropped almost to 0. Hospital readmissions dropped to nothing. Massive amounts of money were saved. Now, here's an interesting thing. This is not rocket science. We know this. We know several thousand people die in hospitals every year because of infections, and we know billions and billions of dollars in private and public money are added to the healthcare system. Guess who the first hospital organization in America to adopt uniform sterilization procedures was? The VA hospital system. But we don't know how to cost that in a way to say, okay, if everybody did it, what will we save? So I'm just saying, we can't solve all these problems today. That's why I want you to focus on what we can do to put people to work now. But I agree with Pete. We've got to show people hope. Look, people have been betting against the United States ever since George Washington fought the Revolutionary War, and people said he had a bad set of wooden false teeth and was a mediocre surveyor who got his brains beat out in every battle he fought before the Revolutionary War started. And they didn't even have shoes when they were going across the Delaware to fight in the winter. People have been betting, and everybody's lost money so far betting against America. That's what we've got to tell people. This is not an impossible hill to climb. Don't bet against us, just do something to make it better. In the meanwhile, the best thing we can do it better is put people in a better frame of mind. The more positive people are, the more willing they are to make the hard decisions to create a better future. That's why what you're doing here could sweep across America and help create a better climate in Washington. If they don't get so much anger from America and there's more hope, they're more likely to sit down together and make a good, positive deal for the future. We got a break and go on to the next session. Thank you all. Thank you.